situation, which I'll start off with a very quick story. I used to, for many years, work for AT&T and AT&T and the AT&T family. And all the way till 2004, I had been part of that telecom kind of a system. And if somebody came to me in 2004, they said, you know what, we think in 10 years from now, AT&T won't be the largest carrier of paid voice minutes in the world, international voice minutes in the world. And I would have fought with that person because I would have said, hey, it's not possible. Who will be bigger? British Telecom, Hong Kong Telecom, China Telecom, not possible. AT&T will remain a dominant player in that area. And actually in 2009, AT&T did surrender, 5 years later. It did surrender that spot. And I'll ask you to guess the name of the company. Can anybody here guess the name of the company? It was actually Skype. And Skype had been born only in August of 2004. So if you had, in 2004, if somebody had asked me this question, Skype didn't exist. And in August of 2004, and I till recently could not put my finger on the country, on the map where that country exists. It's Estonia. It's a little piddly country, few million people, population perhaps the same as Goa. And that changed the communications industry, right? So what happens is that we are in the midst of this kind of nonlinear change. Newsweek people predicted its doom. So in 2007, they did an analyst conference. They said, look, people have been predicting our doom. But every indicator that you can see, readership, engagement, advertising, we are up. And 2011, they ceased to print, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is what the kind of forces that are unleashed is what we will like to talk about. Our belief is that this will be a very non-linear change. And the purpose of our session is for you to understand why this is so. And therefore, you can leverage it and build on it as you go forward. So that's really what we have. It's a wonderful panel. Couldn't have thought of a better panel than this. And we are all going to basically take 7-8 minutes to highlight a portion of this narrative and then open it up for Q&A. We'd like to have as much of Q&A as possible. So may I start with Professor Rishi Krishnan. You have the broadest macro view of what is happening here. So, it will be great if we can start with you. And
Thank you, Sharad. Good afternoon. So I think we all know that digital technologies have the power to transform. But I think what we want to focus on this afternoon is really how big this transformation is really possibly can be, and what do we need to do to make that transformation possible. Because disruptions keep happening, but we want disruptions that help us solve the unique, complex problems that India faces. I mean, many times when I look at startups in India, I find that many of them are imitating what startups in the West are doing, whether it be food delivery or furniture or something like that. But we also know that in India, we have a whole range of very complex problems, including financial inclusion, health, education. And while there's been talk for a long time now that technology can solve these problems, we haven't yet seen those really big changes happening. So we all believe that at this point of time, we are sort of coming to that inflection point where technology can begin to start solving these problems. But for that to happen, there are some basic foundation conditions or some basic platforms which need to be in place. Now, we all know that ideas are central to innovation. That's why this is called the Ideas Conclave. But what we've actually seen very often is when things are changing very rapidly, it's not only about ideas. It's actually about the ability of people to try out experiments and see which of these ideas work. Now, India is often called the graveyard of pilots. And what I'm talking about here is the fact that we have many pilot projects that have happened over time. But many of those pilot projects just remained at the way they were. They never kind of got traction, never scaled up, never actually solved a problem. But at this point of time, with technology changing very rapidly, we have the opportunity that if we can create the right platforms, people can actually do the kind of experiments that can possibly, in a short period of time, transform things. And the important part here is that often it's not the existing players, it's not the large companies. For example, some of our panelists are going to be talking about the financial space. It's probably not the Visa or the MasterCard or any of the large banks who's really going to try and change things in a big way. But the people who can really change things are probably startups who want to try out new ideas. They want to experiment, but we need to create the platform that can help them make those experiments. So what we are really talking about here is in the nature of what economists call public goods, which is essentially some basic platform elements that need to be in place that everybody can access, that are not weighted in favor of incumbents, that allow new entrants to come in at low cost, try things out, and many experiments, that is, people talk about 1,000 flowers blooming. Many of these experiments can happen in parallel, simultaneously, and the multiple good solutions can emerge out of this. And what we are seeing is, for example, in the financial space, where we already have a few things in place. For example, we have Aadhaar, which allows you to look at and verify people's identity. You already have the Jan Dhan Yojana, which is trying to create a whole millions of accounts. And you already have a new set of banks and financial institutions which the RBI has allowed to be created. And you have the entire mobile phone ecosystem with a lot of people upgrading to smartphones. So there are some basic elements in place, but what we are going to argue is that if we can create some basic platforms across these different elements, then we can really allow those thousands of experiments to happen, which will come out with solutions to address some of the really complex problems we have. Complex problems sometimes need complex solutions, but those complex solutions need to ride on some well-established platforms. And as we go through the panel, we'll get examples of what these platforms can look like and how the digital revolution will really drive these platforms.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I go to Sanjay, I like to give you a very quick example. So we sell, Maruti in India sells about 1 million cars, right? So there are, every year, they need support people in the service stations who can support 1 million new cars, right? So they are estimated to be about 30,000 or so people that they need every year to support the new volume of cars that they're putting out on the roads. Now, of course, those million cars are made by 3,000 people. In the factories, they have give and take only about 3,000 or 4,000 people. But the cars that they are designing that will go into production are made only by 30 designers. Now, if you really want to know what the car industry will be tomorrow, who do you think you should go and talk to? The service people, the factory people, or the designers? Obviously, the designers, right? Now, why this session is important is because we have one such designer sitting amongst us, and that is Sanjay. And he is going to describe to you what is actually coming in the future. And his footprints have been there, or fingerprints are there on every big public country scale system that you can think of, starting with Aadhaar. So let me request Sanjay, the former Chief Product Officer of Aadhaar, to describe a little bit of what is happening here.
Thank you, Sharath, for that wonderful introduction. Can I be here? Okay. So we already heard about Aadhaar, and we are currently at around 930 million Aadhaars issued. So that's about 93 crores issued over the last 5 years. Aadhaar provides a basic identity. It allows you to do a verification, and you can check that who you are, who you say you are. It only gives a yes or a no. There's no privacy implications. The next thing that we launched from Aadhaar was something called eKYC. eKYC provides you a paperless way to provide, instead of an Aadhaar card or the letter or whatever we want to call that, it gives you a digital form. So you go to a bank, you open an account, instead of providing your Aadhaar document, you just put your fingerprint and the UIDI gives a digitally signed document to the bank. And that allows you to do a paperless account opening. On top of that, we produce something called e-signature. E-sign is a product launched by the Prime Minister as part of the Digital India launch almost about 6-7 months ago. And that allows you to digitally sign a document using your Aadhaar biometrics. One of the things about digital signatures is you need to prove who you are, and then you can sort of agree to a document, and then the document is modified in a way that it can be traced back to you. So that is done through e-sign, and it's available. Not exactly e-sign, but the similar concept was used when people were allowed to file their income tax returns based on Aadhaar this year. So where the income tax department actually sent out, allowed you to use an OTP to establish your identity to file for electronic tax returns. Over and above this, we have created what is called the DigiLocker, which is again part of the Department of IT. And what that does is it allows somebody to provide a document authorized by them but pertaining to you in a place which is secure. So let's take an example of a degree certificate. My university could say, I hereby grant this degree to Sanjay Jain as on this date, put it in a digital form, put it in a locker where I can then pass it on to somebody. And anybody accessing it knows that it came untouched from the source and can be trusted. And hence it provides a layer of trust. So this is the DigiLocker. All of these together allow you to do what we call a paperless transaction. There's no paper exchange, just bits and bytes, but there is enormous trust in the system. Because all of these are built on public goods, on public APIs, on which, and based on standards on which trust is established. On top of all of these, we have now been working with the National Payments Corporation of India to create what is called the Unified Payment Interface, which then allows this basic trust in the identity system to allow you to make a bank transaction. And now, not only can you do the transaction in a paperless way, you can do it cashless. So just by proving your identity as part of a transaction, you're now able to do all the necessary paperwork and transfer the fees or whatever else is part of the transaction in a cashless manner. And all of these things have been building up over the last, I would say, 2 to 3 years, and UPI should launch within the next few months. And that actually provides us a framework for entire businesses to change the way they do business, for startups to come in with new technology, new ideas, to build on top of it and provide services that even the people who designed the system never imagined. And we are looking forward to that. But there's one last piece, which is the work that's still to be done. And that is where we want to change the way in which you deal with data that pertains to you. So today you make a phone call. The telephone company has a record of your transaction. Or you go do a search on internet. Google has a record of your transaction. You have no idea who they are sharing that information with. When you go apply for credit rating for a loan, different people provide information about you without your knowledge to the creditor so that they can make a loan decision. And we say it is right because the creditor is making a decision, he needs the data. But what we want is that you should be in the center of that sharing of data. So whoever is the service provider should share data with you, and then you share it with the appropriate conditions to the credit provider. So for example, if a new age credit company wants to give loans on the basis of who I spend time talking to on the phone, or who my social network connections are on Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, then they should be able to do that. But only when I share that data with them. And that is what we are calling the consent architecture, where the customer is in the center of his data about transactions, which he provides from the source to whoever needs it under the right conditions. Saying you can only use it to do credit rating. You cannot share it with anybody else. If you give me credit, you can keep it for the duration that you gave me credit. If you don't give me credit, you no longer have rights to use that data. So all of this structure is what we're calling the consent architecture. This is still in the works, and that's what we are doing. And so put together, this provides us a complete layering starting from identity. So you can do so it's what we call the presence-less, cashless, and paperless transaction. And that will allow you to use your mobile phone or whatever to do transactions anywhere, anytime, without actually going to the bank to take a bank loan, for example.
Has any of you used Uber or Ola? Okay, maybe I should be asking the reverse question, if you have not used Uber or Ola. So Uber and Ola is really a result of being built on the fact that three things. Any one you take away, Uber or Ola won't exist. You take away mobile phone, you take away GPS, you take away Google Maps, Uber or Ola will not exist. So these three things put together are called a stack. Somebody innovated on top of this stack and was able to build a fairly complex system because all this was available to them. So these things that Sanjay has described is called the India stack. It's actually in the handbook that you would have received in your package. And on page 9, you'll see the India stack. So why this is powerful is because anybody, literally over a couple of days, can build a very complex system, which is cashless, paperless, and presenceless. And so that is the power of this. Now, one place we want to show you a demo, so that you will actually come, it will come to life. Has anybody got an Apple phone with a fingerprint reader? So you know what we are talking about. The nirvana of payments is that you can go somewhere, your fingerprint on your Apple phone makes payment possible in a single click. Now, believe it or not, that is going to come to hundreds of millions of people in India by middle of next year. And you will see an early version of it at work today.
Anybody has their Aadhaar number here? Could you please? No, anybody who has it here.
So why don't you use mine, Sanjay?
Okay,
so,
I'll use Sharat.
So just to make it simple and fast. So you have mine, 295.
256.
Yeah, 2, yeah. So in India, what's going to happen is that instead of fingerprint reader, the phone will actually use iris, right?
So this is a Samsung tablet. It's an 8-inch tablet. It has only one thing extra, which is at the back. There's a small camera here and a little IR LED, which provides infrared light. And the camera is an infrared camera because iris is captured in infrared. Otherwise, it is exactly like the regular camera. So it contains a little bit of thing to prevent visible light from going, but infrared light to come. And this whole thing costs under 300 to 400 rupees. And so depending on whichever phone they put it in, the cost of that will go up by that much. So this particular thing is on an 8-inch tablet, which is about a 10,000 rupee tablet. And so, so it won't make too much of a difference to the price of it. But what it does is it allows you to authenticate a person, just like the Apple phone does. So I've got Sharad's Aadhaar number here, and I'm going to authenticate. Okay. And at this point, I captured his iris data, and sorry, I need to do it again.
Oh, okay. So what you should expect is that in the future, you will pay the thele wala after buying whatever you did, right? A bhutta from that thele wala, using your mobile phone. Of course, what you're seeing today is a complex version of this, but it will become very simple to use in matter of time. Yeah. My eyes are not wide enough. Maybe the yeah.
You just did it just before.
Yeah. This is the danger of using a live demo, right? Yeah.
No, it captured your eyes closed.
Okay. Okay. Huh.
Let me do it again. At the moment of capture, you blinked. Okay. Yeah, this will work.
Huh.
Why
No?
not try?
Huh.
Yeah, this is the danger of doing live demos. That's my Aadhaar number. Go ahead.
Huh.
Hit authenticate.
So I've actually never done this before. So.
Just need to get my eyes in the center.
Huh.
So this particular version,
Huh.
so
Yeah,
that's
this one works.
my so this particular version is designed for an assisted use where somebody else, like a bank teller, could use it to identify you. But there are versions available where this is on the front, and I'm just going to pass this around so people can see what kind of data we get. Just go ahead, pass it around, please. So, and later I can work with anybody and test it out. But this whole thing is going to cost, just going to add about 300 to 400 rupees to the price of the regular smartphone that you have. And it's...
So why is Sanjay this more powerful than, let's say, Apple Pay? What do you, how would you compare it with something like that?
It's very powerful because of two... With Aadhaar number. with Aadhaar. So the reason it's more powerful is because while Apple Pay uses their own proprietary way of matching fingerprints and their own data store, this matches it against a publicly issued ID using an open API. It can be put on any device. Apple is not going to let any other phone vendor put an equivalent of Apple Pay on their phones. This will allow innovation to come in both in terms of applications and in devices in a way which can never happen with Apple Pay.
So there'll be mass proliferation because almost anybody in the room can build a
Exactly.
system on top of it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So I mean, one of the conversations that is happening is that this is important because if we were not to do something like this, we would essentially end up relying on this
example
concept
is-
of digital colonization. Do you want to
Right.
spend a minute talking about that?
So today in the West, I mean, there's no, actually in the US also, there's no government issued ID you can biometrically authenticate. As a result, all identity is managed by private entities. So when I go into a website, I log into Facebook Connect or Google Connect in ways that they control my identity. And they have access to what I do. It's not a public good. And that identity control itself makes them a massive business. If you sort of step back to where we talk about payment systems, Visa and MasterCard, if they were the ways you were going to go to digital cash, you would end up paying a tax of anywhere about 0.15 to 0.3% of our GDP to Visa and MasterCard as part of providing the service. Same thing if you were to let a private entity take care of your identity, and that would then, you would end up paying a tax to them, and particularly if they're outside the country, that you become so dependent on their systems, and that's like a digital colonization. And what these allows us to do is escape from that.
So, it's important to see this, that Visa and MasterCard are the colonizers for the payment system. And the only country that has really come close to escaping them is Australia. Many countries tried hard. Australia also tried. Unfortunately, they failed. Now, other than that, in the Western world, there's no other country that's even trying today. There are only two countries that have managed to avoid the colonization by Visa and MasterCard. There is China. China did it by not letting Visa and MasterCard operate in China. So if you're a local Chinese, they don't do this. And here in India, in a matter of months, the amount of money flowing through our IMPS, NPCIL system that he talked about, the immediate payment switch, would exceed the total amount of money flowing through Visa, MasterCard, and RuPay. So we would have accomplished this by leapfrogging, just the way we did with mobile. The landline version of this was Visa and MasterCard. The new mobile version of this that you will see come out in the market next year is going to be of course, the next generation, the leapfrog. And we've already accomplished that. Paytm has a big element. So this is probably a good segue to talk about how the whole financial inclusion and the financial space will change. Kabir, you've been in that field for years and you've been very active. Kabir is part of a very simple project. May I mention that it is not very ambitious because it says, look, we dematerialize share certificates in 4 years. Do you think we did the right thing? You remember the days when we had to buy stocks and there were paper. So then Mr. Bhave came along and he dematerialized share certificates in 4 years. Now there is a project underway which says we'll dematerialize cash in India in 4 years. Kabir is part of that team and a very modest objective. So Kabir, give us a flavor of what's coming.
Thanks, Shad. I mean, I don't want to contribute to the Visa, MasterCard, beat up over here, but in Nigeria, they are issuing a national ID, and the cards are MasterCard branded. So they actually did a partnership with MasterCard. So it gives you a flavor of the ambition of these payment companies to really be in this identity payment space globally. Let me take a step back. I'd like to come back to that Thelewala and using the iris authentication and completing a transaction. All of us buying our everyday things with that kind of transaction that you just saw demoed. I'd like to come back to that, but let me take a step back and talk about financial access globally. So we have roughly 2 billion people who don't have formal financial services globally. 20% of them, over 20% of them, are in India. Jan Dhan, 188 million as of a month or 2 months ago, definitely has made a difference there. And I think the subsequent surveys will show a different picture of access in India. But getting people into the formal financial sector has been challenging. It's been challenging for a number of reasons. One is we don't know enough about them, and the kind of information people need, formal financial providers need, banks need, creates a lot of friction to bring people onto the formal financial system. I think we all go through that. The amount of forms we fill out, the information we provide just to become participants, let alone transact, just become participants in the formal financial system. It's a tall order. We are giving up a lot of information just to get to be part of that system. So one is the kind of information that's needed to transact, to participate is extremely high, the tall order. The other challenge is the cost to serve. We're talking about lots of people at very small transaction sizes, very low value transactions, and the existing business models are simply not designed for that, right? And so the branch-based business model or the very high-touch, personalized business model, banking business model, is just not designed to serve a lot of people at very small transaction values. And the third challenge is we just don't have the right financial products. Even today, there's a lot of innovation taking place in the financial sector, but it's still lots of standardized products. Even the kinds of products we get access to are really not designed for us, who we are, how we transact, how we live. They're not really individualized. They're not about our behavior. And when we talk about lots of people who are outside the formal financial sector, we're talking about people who have liquidity challenges every day. They're constantly maneuvering and manipulating liquidity at the household level, right? Sometimes they have a lot of liquidity, sometimes they have no liquidity for weeks, and they have to manage that. In fact, there's a very interesting study that was done across 3 countries where researchers spend over a year with households actually accounting for the money coming in and money going out at each of those households. So they actually did the budget of the household. They tracked it. It's called Financial Diaries. It's a great piece of study. And it showed that the financial lives of poor people are far more active than our financial lives. So on average, they're doing 17, 20 transactions in a monthly period because they have to actively manage very little money. They have to actively manage very little liquidity. So you can imagine the products they need are quite different. They need products that can help them maneuver the liquidity. It's not just a loan or just a savings account. So it's for these reasons we have struggled globally to bring people into the formal financial sector. So let's come back to the Thelewala. So we often talk about this person, a street vendor. Her name is Rajni, let's say, and she's selling fruits and vegetables at the street, but really she doesn't have capital even to get those fruits and vegetables the start of the business day, right? So she borrows. Typically, she's borrowing at 1 to 4% daily interest rate. Based on that borrowing, she's getting the fruits and vegetables from the mandi, and then she's selling those at the street corner. And then, she has to repay the loan, but she also has, and then she pockets some of the cash based on her earnings. But as I was saying, the liquidity is very little. The money she takes home is very little. So she continues to borrow for consumption. She continues to borrow to meet the daily needs of her life. Now, do you believe formal financial providers see any business in serving Rajni? Do they have the ability to actually give her a product? Now, Rajni has an Aadhaar today in India. Most likely, sometime by next summer, if she doesn't have it already, she will have it. Most likely, she already has a smartphone. Probably in a few years, she'll have a smartphone, right? So she has a basic phone today. In a few years, she probably has a smartphone. And this, maybe she participated in the Jan Dhan scheme. Maybe she opened an account, and maybe she's eligible for some government benefits. So now you start seeing the potential of what we can do with someone like Rajni. She has a phone. Over time, that phone is going to get smarter in her hands. She already has an Aadhaar number, and she potentially already has a basic bank account, thanks to Jan Dhan. She's already has that landing account. So one can imagine if she started, let's say, accepting payments from all of us every day, small value transactions electronically, we could build a transaction history on Rajni. And that transaction history, the digital trails that creates, would make her eligible for a loan. So her future, her daily life would be very different. She gets up in the morning, she still needs a loan. On her phone, she says she wants a loan, right? So maybe we have to figure out what that user experience looks like. That's the challenge we're trying to solve. By the time she gets to the Monday, she has 5 loan offers, right? And she presses another button and she's able to exact those loan offers and make those purchases all within the digital realm. So in fact, we are starting to construct, I know someone said India is a land of, what is it? Graveyard of pilots. So I shouldn't use the word pilots, but we're going to actually implement this. We're going to do it at a small scale. We're going to implement it to see how that actually looks like. So that's what this does. India Stack unlocks access to services for someone like Rajni. And globally, we don't have examples of public goods of this nature. We simply don't. Globally, if anything, I was just talking to Sanjay, what we've been trying to do is encourage regulators to create more space for private actors, right? Because it's a failure. We haven't reached these people with formal financial services. So let's unlock and get more private actors in. India has done that. In the last 18 months, 23 new banking licenses, right? And maybe 100 more, at least in the future. So we're unlocking private actors to come in and pursue people like Rajni with a bank account. But in countries where they've been able to do that, some of them have reached a scale that essentially makes them monopolies. In East Africa, 25 million adults, 25 million total population, 20 million are on a privately run payment system run by the monopoly telecom operator. It's known as M-Pesa. And M-Pesa has unleashed a lot of innovation in Kenya, undoubtedly. We have amazing both financial and non-financial products riding on the platform of M-Pesa. But this is a private platform. And we are now relying on the good nature of the individuals who are running M-Pesa. And we know from big and small examples that they are exacting their monopolistic position. It's not extortionary, it's not extreme, but it exists. The better reality is that stuff should be public good, right? So that payments layer, the identity layer, the layer that allows you to participate, to come into the system should be public goods. And I think that's what we're talking about here with the India Stack.
So I think, essentially, what Kabir is pointing out is that credit ecosystem in India will change dramatically. Is any VC here by any chance? Anybody who is a VC? No. You see one of the cushy.
One.
So, all right. So that is one of the cushiest jobs around, right? So you have an entrepreneur, you usually succeed and you turn a VC. Rarely, very rarely do you hear of a situation where a VC goes back to being an entrepreneur. Now in India, this is happening in 3 places. In Delhi, there's a well-known VC, his name is Alok Mittal of Canaan Partners. He's turning entrepreneur. What is he going to do? He is going to attack this new age credit system. In Bombay, the Epiphany Ventures, one of the partners is leaving to become a full-time entrepreneur to guess what? Go after this credit system. In Bangalore, the hottest VC in Bangalore is Angel Prime because there's a person called Chamath, an ex-Facebook person, who has become an anchor investor in the new fund. But one of the 3 partners says, man, this is very interesting, but I have something more interesting to do. Guess what? Go after and set up a company in the credit system. Bala Parthasarathi is his name, very well-known person, Snapfish co-founder. So you are seeing high-quality entrepreneurs gravitate into this field largely because the public platform that enables them, Uber-like the stack that enabled Uber is the stack that now exists to enable financial inclusion, and therefore hope that financial inclusion will get addressed in the hands of the private sector. Building on top of the public platforms is the new idea that we think will take off. So when the VCs are not thinking of becoming entrepreneurs, they are thinking of investing in hot companies. One of the hottest healthcare companies in the world today is a company called Practo. It is the 4th largest funded company in the world in healthcare. They just raised a modest amount of $90 million. They serve 20 million Indians who use their platform for healthcare, 200,000 doctors. But here, Shashank is not so much to talk about Practo, but really to talk about how these same forces are going to radically change primary healthcare in India in the next 5-10 years to come. Shashank, would you like to give us a view on that?
Yeah.
Practo. No, Practo.
Thanks, Sharad. Yes, today, building on the theme that's been set out of how building of public goods can really take an industry forward. We spoke about the finance industry, and we really think that in the healthcare as well, there are going to be leaps that are going to be made in the coming few years. Hidden away for the last 7 years, as Practo, we've been doing a lot. We'll probably touch a little on that a little later. But I think going forward, there's going to be a lot of leap that's going to happen in healthcare. Where are the issues that we are really facing in Indian healthcare? Being ranked 112 out of 190 in the WHO scheme of things of health is really not doing us justice. So where are we really lacking? We're really lacking in accessibility first. It's well known that 70% of Indians are treated by 20% of the doctors. There are just 20% of the doctors who are treating these people. And in our own Practo systems, where we provide scheduling facilities to doctors in urban centers, we provide software to the top 50,000 doctors in the top 35 cities of India, we find a very strange occurrence. The occurrence is that 60% of their time of these doctors in the top 35 cities is available. And yet, we find that, that availability is not being able to be leveraged to all the needful needs of the rural India, where 70% of the people are not having access to good healthcare. So there's a big gap between the supply and demand in both urban and in rural India. In rural India, where the demand outstrips the supply, and in urban centers where supply outruns the demand. So there's a huge gap there. So accessibility is the first thing that we feel is one of the big issues tackling Indian healthcare, and can be solved, but we need to figure out how. We have few thoughts on that. We'll come to that later. The second issue that we have seen happening in India is affordability. Thanks to our $200 per capita spend on healthcare compared to $9,000 in the US, or even the fact that all Indians spend 70% of their healthcare spends come from out of pocket, and 10% of that is only insured, which means we have huge surges in our healthcare expenses, and those are uninsured, and that makes healthcare unaffordable for the large part of Indians. So these are the two main issues that we are grappled with: accessibility because of low skilled workers in all parts of India, and the second one being affordability, where Indians can afford the treatments that they need. The government can play a role in trying to create more doctors and in trying to create more nurses, and also can spend more money. But we know that there are only so much that the government could do. Today, the spend on healthcare is 4%, and it can potentially gravitate towards 5 or 6. So how do we change both? How do we solve for affordability and accessibility with these constraints? That the government has a limited role it can play, and adding doctors is only that much more faster. It will probably take us 10-15 years before we reach the right demand-supply curve. So the answer there is, what we are seeing, and we have seen personally, has been technology. And technology through mobile and internet can really revolutionize the entire space. To give you some examples, there's a company of the name Swasthya Slate. Now, this company has basically about 50 different tests all into one slate, into one tablet. This couldn't have been possible 5 years back because computing would not have allowed you to do 50 tests on one tablet. But today, because computing has moved to a different degree, tablets exist which can do 50 tests on one tablet, which means that what a job of a technician earlier was required, now a tablet itself can do. It has handed down the role of, it has replaced the role of a technician. So this tablet can go into any rural village or any particular place and give you the tests give you the desired results for the particular test without the need of a technician. Now that's possible because of the miniaturization and computing power. And the tests can be done at 1/10 the price. Now that makes it,
Pathological.
that can make it, a lot more affordable for people. Another example is of a company called Forus, and Forus is a company built out of India. Indigenously technology built, which is an eye scanning machine at a very small, very mobile unit that can be taken to villages at one go and can be used for screening. Now the innovation here is that earlier, once you do a screening for any complicated cases, you need to go to a specialist. You need to, to figure out any complicated cases. You need to go to the nearest specialist who is probably, kilometers away or hundreds of kilometers away in a city. But this device can now detect those specialist cases at one go itself and can be treated right away. Now, just because of this, prevention-led device, a lot of cataract cases and cases of blindnesses can be detected much earlier in advance at again 1/10 the cost. The reason this is possible is because this was built indigenously from India, considering India's needs and also considering the cost structures of India, and made it far more affordable and accessible. So there are such examples of where entrepreneurship, technology, and healthcare are coming together and trying to ensure that there is healthcare for all. All that we need to do is build on these public goods and hopefully create stacks that can make it more accessible for more entrepreneurs and for more companies to build on it and create more innovation. Coming to Practo itself, in the last 7 years, we've just on a monthly basis today, 15 million searches happen for doctors on our platform, and that's grown from 1 million 12 months back. From 1 million to 15 million searches in 12 months, we are seeing that 30% of these searches are coming from Tier 2, Tier 3 cities, where people are desperate to finding a good healthcare practitioner and who want to come to a Tier 1 or Tier 2 city for their treatment. Now, and we are also seeing that most of our questions, which are where we have a question answer section where patients can ask questions and doctors will answer questions, most of the questions are generating are from these Tier 2, Tier 3 cities and are being answered by Tier 1, Tier 2 doctors who have the time. The Tier 1, Tier 2 doctors do not want to physically go down there, but have the time to respond to those queries. Right? These are just initial blips of what is possible when the right supply and demand are met. The demand from the 70% of the population in those regions, and the supply which is sitting right here in our urban India. So this is just a glimpse of what is possible and what we can do to eliminate the problems of both affordability and accessibility. I think initial days yet, but growing on the success of the India Stack and how it's doing in the sector of finance, I'm sure that it's going to play a critical role in healthcare as well.
So a very quick question, yes, no answers. Who do you think has more readers, Times of India or News Hunt? No, he knows the answer because he came with me from the airport here. So that's not allowed. So how many of you think it is Times of India? And how many of you think it is News Hunt? All right. So it is News Hunt. And only 5% of the readers are English-speaking readers. How many of you think Make My Trip sells more hotel rooms or Stayzilla sells more hotel rooms? Stayzilla. Padmaja is sitting here. Stayzilla is a IAN investment. It sells, in November, it overtook Make My Trip. Till November, they never ever advertised in the metros. So they became number one by just selling to Tier 2 towns, just like News Hunt. Paytm, where do you think they became big? In Tier 2 towns and then Tier 1? Tier 2, because even today, their typical recharge is 10 rupees. So the new India is not emerging from the big cities. New India is emerging just the way Skype emerged from Estonia. New India is emerging from the smaller cities of India. For them, this India Stack is the democratizing force because they can build valuable companies, global companies sitting from their own places and transform India. So on that note, I'll request Professor Rishi Krishnan to, my question to you, concluding question to you is, what does government do to take advantage of this?
Yeah, so I think one of the controversial issues in innovation has always been what is the role of the government. But what we've seen over the years is that there's a certain kind of democratization of innovation that's happened. And I think we already saw several examples of that. So there's no longer any need for the government to get sometimes directly involved at the innovation level itself. But government needs to create certain supportive conditions. One side where they need to create supportive conditions is on the financing side. We already have the Atal Innovation Mission, which is looking at setting up a big fund of funds to support funding a lot of these innovations. But another very important area is the area of challenge grants. Identifying critical problems for the country and throwing these out as challenges so that we can attract, in a very democratic way, all those hundreds and thousands of innovators to get involved. That's one very important role the government can play on the financing side. The other important role for the government is on the regulatory side. Just remember, we want to attract more and more players to come into the innovation space. Just like we have this paradigm of open innovation, we want more and more people to come in. And the government must therefore create the appropriate regulatory conditions that allow that to happen. We are already seeing that happen in some critical domains like banking, where new payment banks, small banks are creating a democratization of the financial space. And this promises to transform the way the banking industry looks at people like the story which Kabir was telling you about earlier. And let me also assure you that if you think that the big banks are looking at all these new entrants with a lot of glee, let me tell you that's not the case. In fact, many of the big banks are actually quite concerned, particularly at the top management level, of what's going to be the implication of all these newer banking entities coming into the picture. So I think the regulatory side is critical to allow new experiments, new entrants to come in. There are also some important measures on the patenting side, where we don't want, for example, software patenting to come in and reinforce existing monopolies. And on the taxation side, again, the government has to be very careful that we don't kill the golden goose that lays the eggs by having any kind of retrograde steps which prevent a lot more of this experimentation and investment from happening. And from our side, just to complete the story, iSpirit, which is the Indian Software Product Industry Roundtable, is actually a volunteer movement. It's a movement driven by companies which have been successful in the product space. But all the things we're talking about here in terms of advocating public goods, in terms of advocating policy changes, have all been done with volunteer effort and not with any particular business entity or company in mind.
Sharad.
So thank you so much for that. Let's open it up for a couple of questions if we have time. Yeah, thank you. So maybe we can start there, and then I saw a hand go up this side. Yeah.
My question first, I need to ask two questions.
Sure.
Telecom Lab. My first question is to Mr. Sharad, your former AT&T and seen the operator side of the business. How on earth are we going to create a robust financial inclusion structure if the major projects on the infrastructure side, NOFN in its earlier form, BharatNet now, refarming of spectrum from the defense forces, US funded projects like LWE rollouts are badly derailed. So that is the first infrastructure question to you. And the second question is to Mr. Sanjay Jain. After 2 years of investigation, the Director General of Competition Commission of India has filed a report accusing Google of abusing its dominant position and rigging search results, harming competitors, harming users. So how do you answer for that kind of a corporate behavior?
So let me go first. Clearly the issues that you raised need to be addressed. And I think at least on the NOFL side, I think Andhra would be the best example of how it will break through. It is taking the grant from the central government and actually supplementing it and implementing it in a very innovative fashion within the state. So I think many of these hard problems will get resolved through federalism. We got to empower federal mechanisms to solve some of these problems. Obviously, defense spectrum is not amenable to that. And we clearly need to walk the talk when it comes to broadband infrastructure. I think we have a wonderful TRAI chairman, very technologically savvy, and in the current chairman. And I'm personally quite sure that net neutrality, cleaning up the issues with call drops, investment in the mobile infrastructure, those kind of issues will get resolved because you will have a good regulator in place. But other issues need attention. I also want to point out, before I hand over on this Google issue, is that we must make a distinction. I think your question is well founded, because we must make a distinction between the commercial interest of multinational companies and the national interest of India. So as iSpirit is funded by small donors, we don't allow any big donors to come in. We don't take even money from 3 donors. The first one is multinationals. No multinational is a donor to, it cannot be a donor to iSpirit. We don't take money from VCs because we think, while there are many ways to build a company, VC is only one way. And we don't take money from IT services companies because they don't have a product mindset, right? So I think there are ways to resolve that issue. I don't know whether Sanjay wants to comment on Google. He's no longer with Google. How many years away have you been out of Google already?
I've been out of Google about 6 or 7 years now.
Sir,
But really, I think every company needs to be held accountable for their actions. And really, beyond that, there's nothing I can
I think the whole theme of our discussion was that we want to allow a lot of new entrants to come in and prevent the kind of monopolistic behavior which certain large companies have been showing.
See what happened after we'll take, okay, so we have to close after this session. So after this question, we're happy, we are all around for some time and we are happy to take more questions. See what happened in the West is, West built public infrastructure, the public highway system, before that the library system. Even today, I don't know whether you know, there are more libraries in the US, public libraries in the US than there are McDonald's in the US. And these public libraries came in the US before US became a rich country. The argument is that US is rich because public library infrastructure came up, not the other way around. So Western countries were very good at creating public infrastructure. But after 9/11, they lost their way. They got entangled in wars and they stopped building infrastructure, public infrastructure, whether airports, roads, and especially digital infrastructure. And digital infrastructure got built by individual companies, Silicon Valley companies, and they became monopolies. Now we, luckily in India, thanks to the work of a volunteer group of people over 6 years, have created a digital infrastructure in India that is not beholden to any company in the world. We are uniquely placed in the world today to have this India stack. There is no other country in the world that has the same India stack. And therefore, we can fight digital colonization in a way that no other country, including China, can do. And that is if there's one message that we want to leave with you, it is that we are very well positioned in the near future to solve India's problems on the back of this new public infrastructure that has come up, which is not going to be beholden to any one company. Thank you so much. Huh? Yes, sir. Huh? How? Say? Yes.
It's also called Digital India now.
Yes.
At a cost of 75,000 crores of rupees. So currently 250,000 panchayats. That's only the infrastructure.
Yeah. So I'm happy to talk about the Andhra example in that case. Andhra is the most progressive in use. Yeah.
We will take 4,500 crores of rupees. We are putting on the electrical force.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that. Clearly, I think that lady's question was very useful. And as Professor Rishi Krishnan said, the role of the government is to provide that infrastructure and let the innovation at the application layer happen in the private sector. And that is why it is important that it not be in the application layer, but actually building the software infrastructure and the hardware infrastructure that is necessary to power this revolution. So on that note, on that violent agreement, we will bring this to a close. Thank you so much for your patience.